There are stories that unravel so explosively they seem plucked from the most dramatic works of fiction, tales of betrayal, hidden heirs, and unimaginable consequences. This is one such story. Picture a revered millionaire, his influential empire built on brilliance and hard work, teetering on the brink when a scorching scandal explodes. He has fathered a child with his mistress. The world stands aghast, but soon an even more stunning twist emerges. His pregnant wife's unborn baby is the genuine heir to his fortune and future. What unfolds next is a tangle of lies, heartbreak, and the merciless hand of karma, unraveling secrets no one could have predicted. James Lockwood was not always a millionaire. In fact, he had grown up in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Cincinnati, raised by parents who ran a small deli and worked tirelessly to send him to a decent school. Fate smiled upon him, though, and by the time James was 26, he had graduated from the Wharton School with a degree in economics and had begun forging a path that would eventually catapult him into the high echelons of wealth. His brilliance in spotting lucrative investments was almost uncanny. Early on, he became good friends with Edward Kenway, a fellow Wharton alumnus who later joined Morgan Stanley. Edward introduced James to a circle of top-tier investors, hedge fund managers, and venture capitalists. James quickly gained their trust by turning mediocre prospects into thriving ventures, seemingly overnight. Within 10 years, James Lockwood was a name whispered in revered tones in financial corridors from New York to Singapore. His first entrepreneurial triumph was Lockwood Investments, a boutique advisory firm that specialized in identifying underappreciated industries. His big break came when he convinced a group of skeptical investors to pour money into a small biotech startup that ended up creating one of the earliest gene editing technologies. When that company went public, James pocketed enough money to buy himself 3 penthouses in Manhattan, though he decided to settle for just one. At 38, James stood at a personal net worth of over $300 million. That was when he met Catherine Montgomery, the only daughter of a steel magnate from Pittsburgh. Catherine Montgomery was every bit as ambitious as James, albeit in a different way. She was raised in wealth, but recognized early on that her family's empire was too tied to old industries. She wanted to push them into more modern technology-driven markets, and she recognized a kindred spark in James's vision. They married in a grand ceremony at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. Newspapers ran stories about this new power couple who together seemed unstoppable. They had everything, youth intelligence, and a near-limitless network of influential friends. The wedding was a veritable who's who of financiers, industrialists, and even a few Hollywood stars. Edward Kenway was James's best man, publicly jesting. James could probably convince the sun to rise in the west if he had a mind to. The couple set up their primary residence in a sprawling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. James, who once lived in a cramped apartment, now spent weekends strolling around rose gardens and cherishing the expansive property. Catherine threw herself into philanthropic endeavors. She organized charity galas and fundraisers, deeply committed to supporting cancer research and the arts. Her mother had died of a rare form of leukemia, and the cause was close to her heart. Behind the immaculate facade, though the first cracks began to form, James's frenetic schedule left little time for their relationship. In private, Catherine felt neglected. Their initial spark was overshadowed by James's obsession with growth investments and an unquenchable desire to multiply his wealth. Their fights were subdued, but tense. A bruise on the marriage, but not enough to break it yet. And so the seeds of discontent were planted. James Lockwood was on top of the world professionally, but personally, his life was about to enter a storm more destructive than any he had known. Financial success did not quench James's longing for a family. Unbeknownst to outsiders, Catherine and James had been trying for a child for years. Catherine, having come from a big, warm, if somewhat old-fashioned family, yearned to create a loving household of her own. James, for his part, saw a child as the final piece of the puzzle to his perfect existence. A charming spouse, a palatial home, and a legacy to pass on to the next generation. Yet nature had not been cooperative. Doctor after doctor was consulted, tests were run, then rerun. Catherine underwent hormone therapies and changed her diet. James scaled back his overseas trips to be more present, and for several anxious months they tried in earnest to conceive. Each negative test brought heartbreak. Their frustration mounted behind closed doors, and it took a toll on their relationship. During that time, Catherine's father passed away, leaving her in a state of mourning. She inherited a significant stake in the family's steel business, which she now had to manage alongside her philanthropic duties. The stress of these responsibilities only compounded the strain on her body and mind. James tried to be supportive in his own way. He hired additional staff to help Catherine with administrative tasks, brought in top managers to streamline operations, and encouraged her to take breaks. But there was always a distance. Their conversations grew more businesslike. The warmth, the laughter, the simple joy they once shared became rationed luxuries. Then, seemingly out of the blue, Catherine's spirit revived when she received the news she'd been praying for. She was pregnant. It happened during an unremarkable Tuesday after a routine checkup at the fertility clinic. Dr. Martin Klein at Cedars-Sinai, famed for helping high-profile couples conceive, called her personally. His voice was jubilant. Catherine, the test results came back positive. Congratulations. Overwhelmed with relief, she rushed to James's office, tears of joy streaking her face. For a moment, all the tension between them vanished. James, momentarily forgetting about a critical conference call with a group of Middle Eastern investors, swept Catherine into his arms. He even excused himself from his meeting, an almost unheard-of occurrence, and took her out to dinner in a discreet, upscale restaurant. There they spoke of the future with unbridled excitement. The baby's nursery, the possible names, the kind of education they would provide. Everything felt hopeful and right. Catherine was glowing. James had tears in his eyes more than once that evening. They resolved to focus on family, to carve out time in their busy schedules. "Everything changes now," Catherine whispered that night, pressing a hand to her abdomen. James nodded, a rare softness in his eyes. "I know, and it's going to be incredible." For a few weeks, bliss reigned in the Lockwood household. Catherine's morning sickness was intense, but her spirit soared. James took fewer business trips, showed a gentler side, and eagerly shared the happy news with Edward Kenway and a select group of close friends. Catherine's philanthropic circle toasted her whenever she appeared at a gala. At last, the Lockwoods' marriage felt resilient, as if it had weathered its storms and emerged stronger. However, life has a way of throwing curveballs when things appear smoothest. Unknown to Catherine, a new presence had slithered into James's life months earlier, in the form of a gorgeous and cunning woman named Felicia Dumont. A woman who was about to upend everything Catherine believed about her marriage and the future of her family. Felicia Dumont had a face that turned heads wherever she went. Tall, slender, with raven black hair that cascaded down her back, she was dangerously captivating. Born and raised in Paris, Felicia moved to New York in her late 20s. She had ambitions far beyond the typical realm of runway modeling or acting. She wanted a seat at the tables of the ultra-wealthy. Her path crossed with James Lockwood's during a luxury tech conference in Dubai. Felicia worked as a high-end freelance consultant for aspiring European startups, seeking funding from American investors. She would scout potential donors, charm them, and make sure the business deals landed. She was not an industry expert, nor did she pretend to be. Her expertises lay in persuasion and seduction. James had initially approached Felicia in the lavish foyer of the Burj Al Arab. He was asking for directions to a minor breakout session, and she responded with a playful smile. Later that evening, they met again at a networking party among gold-plated decor and a sea of business suits. Felicia was in a sleek emerald gown, her laughter echoing through the room as she effortlessly glided from one cluster of influential men to another. James introduced himself more formally, a slight flush coloring his cheeks as he took in her devastating beauty. One drink led to another, one conversation to a next. They found themselves alone on a balcony overlooking the glittering Dubai skyline. James knew better. He was a married man, albeit a frustrated one. He was also no stranger to fleeting temptations. But something about Felicia's confidence and the way she said his name kept him anchored in place. He told himself it was harmless, that it was just conversation. 2 nights later, after the grand finale of the conference, James found himself in Felicia's hotel suite. Their affair began with the illicit electricity of stolen kisses and whispered secrets. James was not only addicted to her beauty, but also to the sense of power he felt in her presence. Felicia was thrilled to gain a wealthy, well-connected lover who could open endless doors. When they returned to the United States, the affair continued in stolen moments and clandestine weekends. Felicia would fly from New York to Boston to attend networking events, only to spend the night with James in a penthouse suite he kept under a shell corporation's name. Their arrangement was dangerously thrilling for both. James felt as if he'd found an outlet for the stress that weighed on him at home, Catherine's fertility struggles, the demands of business, and the stifling expectation of always being perfect in the public eye. Felicia gave him a world free from those restraints, one where nothing existed except pleasure and risk. But James was careful. He used burner phones, always demanded Felicia maintain secrecy, and never let her take any pictures of them together. Still, the more he tried to control the situation, the more Felicia tested the boundaries. She wanted dinners in public weekends in the Hamptons, a lavish trip to Europe. She wanted recognition. Ultimately, the affair would have stayed in the shadows, only known to a select few discreet staffers or unsuspecting colleagues. Had Felicia not discovered her own life-altering truth, she was pregnant with James Lockwood's child. The news came as a jolt to Felicia. While she had daydreamed of securing a permanent position in James's life, she hadn't considered the reality of becoming pregnant out of wedlock with a married man's baby. In her head, she saw the child as a golden key, a potential route to financial security, beyond her wildest dreams. But she was also keenly aware of the precariousness. James could deny her, threaten her, or quietly push her out of his life. Felicia's cunning mind whirled with possibilities. She decided that revealing the pregnancy to James would be her trump card to be played at the right moment. Possibly he would leave his wife for her, or at least offer enough hush money to keep her comfortable. She believed she could control the narrative. Little did she know that fate was preparing a more complicated script with far higher stakes than even she anticipated. For Catherine Lockwood was pregnant too and determined to keep her family intact. It was a phone call that ignited Catherine's suspicions. Late one evening, as she sat in the family room sorting through invitations for upcoming charity galas, James's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He was upstairs in his study reviewing a major acquisition for Lockwood Investments. Catherine glanced at the phone's screen and saw only the initials FD and a strange, unrecognizable number. She hesitated, feeling a prickle of discomfort along her spine. James often had calls from people with cryptic initials, lawyers, bankers, or foreign collaborators. Yet something about FD triggered alarm bells. Perhaps it was the hour, or that James had been increasingly secretive. Lately, he had been receiving texts during dinner and stepping outside to answer calls. Initially, she tried to dismiss it. She was pregnant and emotionally sensitive, prone to overthinking. But the small seed of doubt planted itself firmly. That night, she asked James about his day, about any new ventures, trying to glean any mention of someone with the initials FD. He was vague, only offering generalities about ongoing deals in Europe. Over the following weeks, Catherine's unease grew. James seemed absent-minded. He'd returned from business dinners, looking exhausted, smelling faintly of perfume she didn't recognize. At times, a flicker of guilt crossed his face when their eyes locked. Still, Catherine tried to push away her suspicions, attributing his detachment to the stress of fatherhood. But then there was the strange envelope that arrived at their Connecticut estate one afternoon. Marked confidential, it was addressed to James, but no sender information was provided. Catherine recognized the neat, feminine handwriting. When she picked it up, she felt a tremor of foreboding. She walked it to James's study, placing it on his desk. Later that evening, she noticed it had vanished. He never mentioned it. Unable to bear the mounting anxiety, Catherine confided in her closest friend, Julia Penrose, an interior designer whose son attended the same private school Catherine once hoped her child would attend. Julia was shocked that Catherine even suspected James of infidelity. Like everyone else, she believed James was the consummate gentleman. But Catherine's pallor and trembling voice betrayed a deep-seated fear. Julia suggested Catherine hire a private investigator to confirm or dispel her worries once and for all. Catherine balked. She found the idea invasive, borderline paranoid. But the more she thought about it, the more it seemed the only way to preserve her sanity. She could not live in a limbo of guesswork. Enter Walter Thompson, a discreet private investigator based in New York City. He came recommended by Julia's friend, who had once used his services for a sensitive financial matter. Catherine arranged a covert meeting at a small cafe on the Upper East Side. She arrived wearing a simple hat and sunglasses, her nerves frayed. Walter, an unassuming man in his mid-50s, listened attentively to her story. "I don't want tabloid fodder," Catherine insisted, sipping her chamomile tea. "I just want the truth." Walter nodded. "I understand. Trust me. I handle these cases with discretion. I'll need James's travel itinerary, phone details, and any leads on who this FD might be." Within a week, Walter had turned up enough to confirm Catherine's worst fears. James had been repeatedly traveling to Boston on weekends, staying in a penthouse suite under a corporate alias. He had been spotted with a tall, dark-haired woman, always checking in together, though never once photographed in a compromising situation. Still, there was enough circumstantial evidence. When Catherine received the preliminary report, she felt her world tilt on its axis. She had to press a trembling hand to her swollen belly, as if to stabilize herself. This was betrayal at its rawest. She remembered every vow James had ever spoken, every promise of love, safety, and devotion. It all felt like a house of cards collapsing under the faintest breeze. Walter recommended she wait for more conclusive proof if she intended to confront her husband. He suggested a stakeout, or perhaps obtaining phone records with Catherine's permission, since most of the lines were in the family's name. Catherine, torn between heartbreak and a desire for clarity, gave the go-ahead. Over the next 2 weeks, the details grew painfully clear. The woman's name was Felicia Dumont. She traveled frequently. James had been paying for flights and extravagant dinners. The bills were coded under client relations in Lockwood Investments expense reports, Catherine's inner circle. Her dear friend Julia, and now Walter, urged caution. She was pregnant, vulnerable, and extremely emotional. The mere thought of confrontation made her nauseous and lightheaded. But fate would not wait for Catherine's readiness. It had its own timeline, one that would soon collide with the carefully cultivated secrecy of James and Felicia in a spectacular, life-altering way. Felicia Dumont faced her own set of anxieties. After multiple at-home tests and one visit to a private clinic near Fifth Avenue, she confirmed she was pregnant with James's child. She waited nearly a month before telling him. When she finally did, James reacted with shock and a swirl of conflicting emotions. He had always used protection, but no method was infallible. The reality of fathering a child with his mistress crashed down on him. He was excited at the prospect of having a child. Fatherhood had always been a dream, but it was overshadowed by the precarious nature of his situation. Catherine was pregnant too, and they had just started rebuilding the closeness in their marriage. "Felicia, you need to keep this quiet," James implored one night, pacing a penthouse living room high above Manhattan. "Catherine can't find out. Not now." Felicia, seated on a plush white sofa, crossed her arms. "I'm not the one shouting about it," she retorted. "But I won't hide forever." And that was the crux of it. Felicia wanted a guarantee for her future and for the babies. She dangled the possibility of going public, threatening to reveal the truth or to approach one of the tabloids if James didn't secure her financially. She wanted a luxury townhouse, a monthly allowance, and the promise that her child would inherit. James found himself torn. He had always been a strategic thinker, able to handle the complexities of multi-billion-dollar mergers with ease. But this was personal, messy, and emotional terrain he was unaccustomed to navigating. He offered Felicia a sizable apartment in Soho, fully paid for, and promised child support once the baby was born. But he stopped short of guaranteeing the child's place in his formal legacy. Felicia swallowed her frustration. She recognized that pushing too hard, too soon, risked alienating James completely. For the moment, she accepted the apartment, though she insisted on putting it in her name. James agreed, albeit reluctantly. His fear of losing everything he had with Catherine, combined with the swirling thrill of impending fatherhood, left him paralyzed. Meanwhile, Catherine was approaching her second trimester. Her belly was growing. Her cheeks were flushed with the glow of pregnancy, although her heart felt heavier each day. She was now certain James was cheating, but she had not yet confronted him. She worried that any explosive argument could harm the baby or trigger a stress-related complication. Every night she observed him, his tired eyes, the abrupt phone calls he took behind closed doors, the anxious lines on his face. She knew he was wrestling with secrets. She even wondered if he sensed that she, too, was onto him. But every day they went on with the facade of a loving couple, hosting dinner parties, attending charity galas. Yet the veneer was thinning. Catherine noticed him falter during these social appearances, offering forced smiles and half-hearted conversations. Their friends commented on how exhausted James seemed. The deeper the deception, the heavier the toll it took on his psyche. 2 pregnancies, 2 futures. James was now responsible for 2 new lives in drastically different situations. One child he had wished and prayed for with his wife, the other a product of forbidden passion. Yet, ironically, no one outside James, Felicia, and Catherine's private investigator truly knew the magnitude of this drama. In this fraught atmosphere, events began to accelerate. Felicia's demands increased. She was nearing the end of her first trimester, grappling with morning sickness and insecurities about her future. Catherine was silently gathering evidence, and James's business life was piling on pressure as well. An unfavorable trade war threatened to undermine several of his global investments, placing Lockwood investments in a precarious position. In short, the storm clouds had gathered. The collisions, both personal and professional, were inevitable, and they would leave no one unscathed. The next pivotal turn arrived in the form of an invitation to a high-profile charity gala in Manhattan, hosted by none other than Teresa Huang, a well-known genealogist from Stanford University, who also held philanthropic interests in pediatric care. A glittering event it brought together celebrities, philanthropists, and top business magnates to raise funds for advanced genetic research. The irony was not lost on James. He was juggling 2 pregnancies with 2 different women, all while attending an event that focused on genetic legacies and healthcare. Catherine, despite her inner turmoil, insisted they both attend. She was a patron of the gala and had even donated a substantial amount in memory of her late mother. James agreed, hoping to maintain appearances and keep suspicion at bay. Dressed in a flowing emerald gown, Catherine glowed in her pregnancy, earning compliments from all corners of the ballroom. James stood beside her in a tailored tuxedo, forcibly smiling whenever a camera flashed their way. Beneath the polished veneer, every nerve in his body was on edge, especially because Felicia was also rumored to be in attendance. Sure enough, Felicia arrived accompanied by a startup founder she was supposedly consulting for. She radiated in a sleek black dress, eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk on the hunt. And then it happened. Felicia locked gazes with Catherine from across the room. It was not the passing glance of a stranger. It was a charged moment that Catherine, with her sharpened intuition, instantly recognized as a silent challenge. Catherine felt her stomach churn, not just with the typical nausea of pregnancy, but with an icy dread. She discreetly alerted Julia Penrose, who was also at the gala. "That woman in black." Catherine whispered, "She's the one." Julia's eyes widened. "Are you certain?" Catherine nodded. "There's a look in her eyes, like she wants me to know." At one point during the evening, James excused himself to speak with potential donors. Catherine, determined to keep her composure, mingled through the crowd, making small talk about art auctions and upcoming philanthropic events. But her thoughts kept returning to Felicia's piercing stare. The confrontation came unexpectedly in the ladies' powder room, an opulent salon with gilded mirrors and fresh orchids arranged on marble countertops. Catherine was touching up her makeup, mentally bracing herself for the possibility of crossing paths with Felicia. She almost hoped it wouldn't happen. But then Felicia stepped in alone, crossing the threshold with slow, deliberate steps. Their eyes met in the mirror. Silence. Catherine's heart raced. Her reflection in the mirror showed a poised woman, but inside she was trembling. Felicia stood behind her, an elegant figure exuding quiet confidence. Finally, Felicia broke the hush. "I'm surprised you don't know me," she said, her tone laced with an arrogance that curdled Catherine's blood. Catherine drew in a measured breath. She turned around, meeting Felicia's direct gaze. "I think I do. A thin smile curved Felicia's lips. "Then you know that your husband and I have business together." Catherine felt her throat constrict. The worst part of it all was Felicia's sheer audacity. This wasn't a timid woman apologizing or feeling remorse. It was someone who believed she held the upper hand. And that business would be what exactly? Felicia shrugged, placing a hand over her abdomen so lightly that Catherine would have missed it if she wasn't watching closely. "Ask James," she said, her eyes flicking down to Catherine's pregnant belly. "I'm sure you'll both figure it out eventually." The tension was suffocating. Catherine's voice trembled slightly, but she refused to back down. "Are you proud of yourself?" Felicia didn't hesitate. "I'm proud of my baby, and I'll do whatever it takes to ensure its future." With that, Felicia turned on her heel and glided out of the room, leaving Catherine pale and shaking. She clutched the marble countertop for support, her mind spinning. The vague suspicion was now a concrete reality. Felicia was pregnant, carrying James's child. Catherine spent the remainder of the gala in a trance, performing her social duties on autopilot, while her mind replayed Felicia's words. When they finally left, Catherine sank into the limo seat beside James, silent and distant. James tried to speak, but Catherine's curt "Not tonight" sealed his lips. At home, Catherine retreated to the guest bedroom, leaving James in a restless, sleepless vigil. The next morning, the phone began ringing before dawn. Word had leaked about a potential scandal swirling around the Lockwoods. Some journalist from a niche gossip site had made inquiries. Then James received a text from Felicia. "We need to talk. I want more." The gloves were off, and Catherine, who had once cherished the dream of a perfect family, was now preparing for war, even if it meant the end of her marriage, her public reputation, and everything she had worked to maintain. While James's personal life spun out of control, his professional world was also crumbling. A sudden downturn in global markets hit Lockwood investments hard, courtesy of a new wave of tariffs and political upheaval in Asia. James had large stakes in emerging tech companies that now faced supply chain disruptions. To make matters worse, rumors of James's affair were beginning to swirl in certain business circles, news that threatened investor confidence. Edward Kenway, longtime friend and collaborator, arranged an urgent meeting in Manhattan. The two men sat in a private conference room at Morgan Stanley's headquarters, the sleek glass walls affording a panoramic view of the city. Edward wasted no time. "James, the board is nervous. They're hearing whispers, something about a scandal involving you and an employee." James bristled. "She's not an employee, Edward. She's a consultant, a freelancer." Edward's gaze hardened. "It doesn't matter who she is. Investors only see a potential nightmare. They think if you can't keep your personal house in order, you might not be able to handle the stress of managing their millions." James ran a hand through his hair, which had begun to show early streaks of grey over the last few months. "It's complicated, and it's under control." "Is it?" Edward's voice rose in frustration. "Catherine's pregnant. Now I'm hearing Felicia is too. You're risking everything you've built because you couldn't keep your pants zipped." The barb stung, but James knew Edward spoke truth. "I'll handle it, Ed. Just give me some time." Time, however, was a luxury James didn't have. The meltdown in the markets required swift, decisive action. Several major investors threatened to pull out, concerned about James's capacity for leadership amid scandal and economic turbulence. James found himself working around the clock, juggling crisis talks, conference calls with global partners, and relentless damage control. He even tried to placate Felicia, who was rapidly becoming more aggressive in her demands. She threatened to go public If he didn't offer her financial guarantees, including trust funds for the baby, and a substantial monthly stipend, far beyond the apartment in Soho. Felicia's leverage was that she could sell her story to tabloids or confide in a nosy journalist, unleashing a tidal wave of negative press that could sink Lockwood investments. In the midst of all this, Catherine made the decision to confront James directly. She could no longer suffer in silent anguish. One evening she waited until he returned from a grueling board meeting. He looked exhausted, tie-loosened eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She stood in the foyer, arms folded over her pregnant belly. "We need to talk," she said, her tone rigid. James's shoulders slumped. He saw the steely resolve in her eyes and knew there was no escaping the conversation. They moved to the library, a stately room with dark mahogany shelves lined with volumes of finance history and literature. Catherine closed the door behind them, a deliberate act that made James's heart pound. "I know everything," Catherine said, voice shaking. "I hired a private investigator. I even spoke to her at the gala. She's pregnant with your child." James rubbed his face in his hands. "Catherine, I never meant. Don't insult me with excuses." Catherine snapped, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "You made a choice. You chose her over me, over our family, over our child." He stepped toward her, attempting to place a hand on her shoulder. She recoiled. "I didn't choose her. It was a mistake. One that spiraled out of control." She let out a bitter laugh. "Spiraled out of control, James. You have a mistress living in a $1 million apartment. She's carrying your baby. That's not just a mistake. It's a second life." James's composure cracked. "I was overwhelmed, Catherine. I didn't know if we'd ever have a child. Our marriage felt distant. I was lonely and stressed." Her voice quieted, laced with anguish. "We were distant because you threw yourself into work at every opportunity, because you refused to acknowledge how much I needed you." Silence enveloped them thick with regret and sorrow. James couldn't look her in the eye. Finally, Catherine took a trembling breath. "I'm going to remain in this house. This is our child's home. Whether you stay or leave is up to you. But if you want to salvage anything, your relationship with me, with this baby, you will end things with her. Completely." James nodded, tears threatening to fall. "I will," he whispered. "I promise." Yet as determined as he seemed, the reality of extricating himself from Felicia's clutches was not simple. Felicia would not go quietly. Not when she believed she had the ultimate trump card, the unborn child who in her mind deserved an inheritance and a father's name. As the Lockwood empire teetered on the edge, stock prices fluctuating, investor trust waning, James faced the most critical juncture of his life: sever ties with Felicia and risk an explosive scandal, or continue placating her, which would surely destroy his marriage and further erode his business reputation. Time was ticking. Soon the locked doors and hushed whispers would no longer suffice. The truth was about to break in a very public, very devastating way. Under intense pressure, James told Felicia the affair had to end. He offered a final settlement, enough money to ensure her child would be cared for comfortably until adulthood. But to Felicia, the deal fell short of her ambitions. She wanted not just financial security. She wanted acknowledgement, a seat at the Lockwood table, and the prestige of being tied to James Lockwood's name. "This child is yours," Felicia insisted during a tense meeting in her Soho apartment. You're going to deny him everything he's entitled to. James's nerves frayed. I'm not denying anything, he said, voice trembling with pent-up frustration. I'm just not making him my sole heir. You knew the situation. Felicia, in a moment of fury, threatened to schedule a media interview. I'll go to the highest bidder. Let the tabloids tear your precious family apart. I have proof photos, texts, even your wire transfers. James froze. He had always been meticulous, but apparently not meticulous enough to prevent Felicia from gathering incriminating evidence. His mind raced with possible countermoves, legal injunctions, hush money, or intimidation, none aligned with the man he believed himself to be. Ultimately, Felicia's greatest bargaining chip was the baby's paternity proof, that James was the father. Catherine demanded a similar test. If Felicia's child truly was James's, Catherine wanted official documentation. She wanted no illusions or denials. Enter Dr. Martin Klein once again, along with a private genetics lab, recommended by Teresa Huang, who had offered to discreetly facilitate the test for both pregnancies. Catherine intended to confirm James's paternal status regarding Felicia's child. Felicia saw this as an opportunity to force James's hand if the test returned positive. James himself, reeling from the stress, complied, if only to quell the swirling doubts. Everyone expected the test to confirm what they already believed, that James Lockwood was the father of Felicia's unborn baby, and also father of Catherine's. They all anticipated a double confirmation that would only heighten the tension. But life, unpredictable and cunning, had other plans. On a stifling August afternoon, Dr. Klein called each party to arrange a meeting at his private Manhattan clinic. Felicia arrived first, wearing a sleek maternity dress, her confidence radiant despite the drama. Catherine arrived next, pale but resolute, accompanied by Julia Penrose for moral support. James arrived last, accompanied by his attorney, a man who had spent the past decade quietly handling Lockwood Investments' complicated deals. Dr. Klein's expression was grave as he ushered them into a confidential suite. Catherine clenched her fists, steeling herself for more heartbreak. Felicia's lips curved in a triumphant smirk, certain her baby's rightful claim would soon be validated. James stood between them, feeling as though his entire life had narrowed to this claustrophobic room with two pregnant women and his entire future on the line. There's no easy way to say this. Dr. Klein began adjusting his glasses. We have the results. He shuffled a set of papers. First, Catherine's child. The paternal DNA matches James Lockwood's profile. The probability of paternity is 99.99%. Congratulations, Mr. Lockwood. You are indeed the father. Despite the tension, James felt a flood of relief. Catherine inhaled shakily, a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow in her eyes. She already knew James was likely the father, but hearing it confirmed brought everything to a sobering reality. Felicia cleared her throat. And my test results? Dr. Klein's expression darkened further. Miss Dumont, the test indicates that James Lockwood is not the father of your child. A dead silence followed. For a moment it seemed the air had been sucked out of the room. Felicia's eyes widened in shock, her poised facade cracking like shattered glass. That's impossible, she stammered. There must be a mistake. James's attorney narrowed his gaze. Are you certain? Dr. Klein nodded. We rechecked the samples twice to be sure, Mr. Lockwood's DNA does not match the fetal DNA from Miss Dumont's sample. There's a 0% probability of paternity. Felicia's world imploded. She remembered the fleeting affair with a French entrepreneur in Boston a night of indiscretion while James had been away on an extended trip. She had convinced herself it was inconsequential. Or perhaps she had deliberately pinned James as the father, hoping to secure her golden ticket. Either way, the truth was out. Anger and humiliation twisted Felicia's features. "You're lying," she spat at Dr. Klein. "I want a second opinion." James, initially too stunned to speak, finally found his voice. "We have the results." "There's no mistake," he murmured, his shock giving way to a cautious sense of liberation. Felicia, the woman who had threatened to destroy his marriage and business, had built her claim on a lie. Catherine watched Felicia's meltdown, tears of rage and desperation coursing down the other woman's cheeks. In that moment, Catherine felt a mixture of pity and revulsion. This was the woman who had nearly shattered her life, and now she stood exposed before everyone. Felicia stormed out of the clinic, ignoring Dr. Klein's attempts to calm her. Catherine and James stood rooted in place, absorbing the seismic shift in their circumstances. The truth was out. James Lockwood had only one child on the way, Catherine's. Their child was the true heir. For Catherine, it was a moment of vindication. For James, it was a narrow escape from an even darker personal and public catastrophe. But the damage was done, and the wheels of karma had only just begun their turning. The explosive revelation reverberated through James's personal and professional spheres. Word traveled swiftly that Felicia Dumont's claim to the Lockwood fortune was false, and that her unborn child was not James's. While James felt a sense of relief, his reputation had still taken a blow. He had engaged in an affair, fatherhood scare or not. Felicia, in a desperate attempt to salvage her own image, leaked part of the story to an online tabloid. She framed herself as a scorned lover, a victim of James's manipulative promises. She didn't mention the paternity test that disproved his role. Instead, she spun a narrative of how James had coerced her into an affair, then abandoned her in her time of need. The tabloid ate it up, running incendiary headlines like, "Billionaire Lockwood's secret mistress speaks out, pregnant and alone." Overnight, James became the focus of media frenzy. Stock in Lockwood investments dipped further as investors panicked over the mounting scandals. Edward Kenway pleaded with James to issue a public statement to quell the storm. Catherine watched the news unfold from their Connecticut estate. Though the truth cleared James of fathering Felicia's child, the betrayal of the affair was still a dagger through Catherine's heart. She endured phone calls from well-meaning friends, expressing shock acquaintances, fishing for gossip, and philanthropic circles that now treated her with hushed sympathy. At home, the tension between Catherine and James simmered. He was no longer denying his wrongdoing, but the trust between them was practically scorched earth. Catherine allowed him to stay in the mansion primarily because they needed to maintain a unified front against the raging media, and for the sake of her pregnancy. However, they slept in separate bedrooms. Conversations were tense, limited to logistics about the upcoming birth or the best way to handle the media. Amid all this chaos, a deeper crisis unfolded at Lockwood Investments. Major clients had begun to withdraw their funds, citing lack of confidence in the firm's stability. The media debacle only amplified the existing market pressures. Edward Kenway convened an emergency board meeting to discuss the future of the company. "We're hemorrhaging clients," Edward explained, addressing James and the rest of the board. "If we don't do something drastic, we could be looking at a collapse or a hostile takeover." Some board members blamed James directly for the fiasco. His personal drama, they said, had frightened investors and tarnished the firm's sterling reputation. A few even whispered about forcing him out as CEO. Facing this mounting opposition, James tried to rally them. He offered a strategic realignment, pledged to focus on stabilizing current holdings, and vowed to step away from any further public controversies. But the damage was done, and any solution that might save Lockwood investments demanded swift, brutal measures, massive layoffs, liquidation of certain assets, a public apology to appease shareholders. James returned home that night feeling utterly defeated. He found Catherine in the sitting room, reading a book on pregnancy. She acknowledged him with a distant nod. After a pregnant pause, he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "This is all my fault," he confessed, voice muffled. "I've ruined everything." Catherine's expression was unreadable. She set the book down. "You made terrible choices, James, but you have to fight to fix what you can. For our child's future." He lifted his head, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "I don't know if we can ever go back to how things were." A sad smile tugged at her lips. "I don't either. But for now, we focus on what's necessary, stabilizing the business and ensuring a safe environment for the baby." James nodded, tears threatening to spill. "I'm sorry," he said softly, though he knew apologies could only do so much. Days melted into weeks. Media coverage soared whenever Felicia leaked new tidbits, but the sensational story began to lose steam when Dr. Klein privately confirmed to the press that paternity tests did not match James's DNA. Public opinion turned against Felicia, painting her as a gold digger who tried to trap a billionaire. She lost credibility, lost prospective clients, and found the door to high society slammed shut. The hush money and sympathy she hoped to rake in vanished. As for James, the board demanded he step down temporarily as CEO to focus on damage control. Edward Kenway was appointed interim head, and an external PR team was brought in to manage the crisis. Thousands of employees worried about their jobs. Tens of thousands of investors held their breath, and James discovered that life at the summit was far more precarious than he'd ever realized. And then, in the midst of the swirling chaos, Catherine went into labor. It was a stormy night when Catherine's contractions began. Thunder rumbled outside, rain lashing against the windows of the Connecticut estate. James rushed her to the hospital, heart pounding in his chest, a swirl of anxiety and excitement fueling his every step. Dr. Klein met them at the hospital, having been kept on standby for weeks. The labor was intense, lasting nearly 18 hours. During the last excruciating hours, Catherine clutched James's hand, both of them tearful. It was as if, in this moment of vulnerability and pain, the magnitude of their connection surged back, reminding them that they were bound by something far greater than a mere contract or social standing. Finally, as dawn broke, Catherine delivered a healthy baby boy. The newborn's cry pierced the sterile air, and James felt a rush of love so profound it nearly toppled him. Catherine wept with relief and exhaustion, her gaze never leaving the tiny life she now held in her arms. There, in that delivery room, the illusions and betrayals seemed distant for a fleeting moment. The child with James's hair color and Catherine's eyes was the real heir to the Lockwood name, an innocent life untouched by scandal. This was the future that James and Catherine had longed for, a symbol of hope in the midst of their battered world. Karma's reach. Yet karma rarely forgets. Felicia, exposed and scorned, faced financial ruin and social ostracism, the father of her child. Her brief tryst from Boston wanted no part in raising it, and refused any responsibility. Felicia was left alone, shamed by the same high society she once courted. She had to sell her Soho apartment to cover her mounting debts, and with her consulting reputation tarnished by scandal, her once promising career prospects evaporated. She found herself reliant on meager freelance gigs overshadowed by the memory of what she almost had and lost. Lockwood Investments also had a reckoning. The firm survived the storm, but had to downsize drastically. Several major projects collapsed, and James's net worth plummeted. Though still wealthy by most standards, he was no longer the unstoppable financial titan. He learned the price of arrogance, of placing ambition and fleeting desires over loyalty and honesty. Catherine's road to healing was a slow one. After the baby's birth, she focused on motherhood, immersing herself in the rhythms of caring for her newborn son, whom they named Henry Montgomery Lockwood, a nod to her own lineage. She took a break from public philanthropy, spending quiet mornings in the garden, feeding Henry and reading to him while the sun warmed their corner of the estate. James devoted himself to being the best father he could be. He was determined not to repeat the sins of his own father, who was largely absent during his childhood. Even as he grappled with the ongoing financial complications, he carved out time for late-night feedings, diaper changes, and lullabies. Slowly, Catherine allowed him closer sharing moments of tenderness over Henry's crib. The path to rebuilding trust was long, and they both knew it. But the presence of their baby offered a fresh, if fragile, beginning. In the end, the real heir turned out to be the child born of marital love, the child whose existence reminded everyone that no lie, no affair can overshadow the purity of genuine family bonds. And for James, the hardest lesson arrived in the form of karmic justice. He nearly lost everything chasing a mirage, only to discover that true fortune lay in what he already had. His wife, his family, and the child who now smiled up at him with innocent wonder. Months after Henry's birth, the Lockwood mansion felt simultaneously quieter and fuller. Many of the household staff had been let go to cut expenses, leaving a more intimate environment. Catherine's father's steel company was thriving under new management she had appointed, allowing her the freedom to prioritize her son. James officially resumed his position at Lockwood Investments, though the board remained watchful. Under Edward Kenway's interim leadership, the firm stabilized. Now, with James back, they charted a conservative path forward. Instead of high-stakes gambles, James focused on sustainable growth, forging alliances that emphasized ethical governance and transparency, terms he once considered marketing gimmicks, but now embraced with genuine respect. Catherine and James underwent couples therapy not for a quick fix, but to establish a foundation of communication and respect. Their relationship morphed into something different. Cautious, yes, but also more honest and rooted in mutual responsibility. The memory of James's betrayal did not vanish, but over time it integrated into the tapestry of their marriage. Some days were harder than others, and forgiveness was never a linear journey. But Henry gave them a reason to hope. Felicia Dumont's fall from grace was swift and harsh. She delivered her child in a small clinic outside Manhattan, covered by the meager insurance plan she managed to secure. Without high-profile clients or influential contacts, she was forced to relocate to a modest apartment in Queens, living a life worlds apart from the opulence she once tasted. Occasionally, rumors surfaced that she tried to peddle more stories to tabloid journalists, but interest in her tale faded as quickly as it flared. She was left to confront her choices, raising her child alone. The father provided no support. Felicia was in a battle with him for paternity recognition, though ironically she had once tried to pass the child off as James's. In a final twist of serendipity, Catherine resumed her philanthropic work, in a small capacity contributing to a community center that offered prenatal and parenting classes for single mothers. She did it quietly without fanfare, because in that vulnerable time, she recognized that even those who made terrible decisions, like Felicia, should have resources to ensure their children didn't suffer. The gesture wasn't exactly forgiveness, but it was empathy born out of Catherine's own experiences with heartbreak and betrayal. James spent many hours in his newborn son's nursery, reflecting on the arc of his life, how he rose from nothing to become a wealthy titan, only to nearly lose everything chasing illusions. He realized Henry was the truest form of wealth he could ever claim. And each time he kissed the baby's forehead, each time he felt the tiny fingers curl around his own, he remembered what it meant to have a second chance. In that sense, the final moral of the story is simple and profound. Fortunes can be made or lost, scandals can erupt and fade, but real wealth rooted in loyalty, love, and the innocent hope of a child endures no matter how fiercely the winds of karma may blow. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of love, betrayal, and redemption. The Lockwood story reminds us that no amount of money or success can shield us from the consequences of our choices. In the end, karma finds its way, exposing our deepest truths and reminding us of what truly matters: honesty, family, and integrity. If you enjoyed unraveling this gripping tale, complete with shocking twists and real-life lessons, please take a moment to support our channel. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions help us bring more riveting stories to life. We appreciate your time and hope this dramatic account will linger in your mind, reminding you that even in the darkest betrayals, there can be hope, healing, and sometimes a precious new beginning. Hit that like button, share this video with friends, and subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching.